So meet Sydney and Cliff. They are newlyweds who decided to spend their honeymoon in Hawaii. Heading to the next beach, our couple stops at a store to buy supplies and refresh the map of the route. At the store, a local man warns them that it's at least 11 miles one way to the nearest beach and reminds them to bring tickets, without which access to the beaches is restricted. Having checked all the necessary documents and bought provisions, the couple set off. On the way, they meet a couple of voting tourists, and Cliff decides to stop and give the guys a ride. Sydney is completely reluctant to take strangers along, but Cliff reassures her, saying that nothing bad can happen in Hawaii. At that moment, a girl named Cleo jumps into the car, and her boyfriend Cale is already throwing things into the trunk of the car. Cleo tells them that they need to drive to a beach a few kilometers away. Cliff agrees at first, but seeing the look in his wife's eyes, the man tricks them. He says they are not driving that far across the island. Cale hears this and gets very angry, and tells Cleo to get out of the car immediately. But Cleo, tired of waiting for the car, tries to make our newlyweds feel better and shows them her wedding photos, because they are also newlyweds. Then Cindy and Cliff look at each other approvingly and agree to let them down. But Cale angrily insists, and Cleo has to get out of the car. Cliff and Cindy continue on their way. Having finally arrived at the beach, our couple sets off on a hiking trip. On one of the trails, they come across a dangerous pass, where they get acquainted with a very talkative guy named Nick. The man passes the pass first. And then he rescues Sydney, who could fall into the abyss because of the helicopter. After that, the guys decide to continue their journey together. On the road, Cliff tells them that he is a screenwriter. Nick is greatly interested in this, because he once dreamed of writing screenplays and books himself. Then the guys meet some worried girls, who tell about the murder of newlyweds on a neighboring island. Nothing concrete is yet known about this incident, except that the killers are most likely a man and a woman. Hearing this news, our couple is a little worried, but they are not going to spoil their honeymoon, so they bravely continue their journey. A little later, Nick leads the newlyweds to a waterfall where his girlfriend Gina is swimming. While Sydney swims with Nick and Gina, Cliff goes to the mountain in hopes of catching a connection and finding out what is known about these events on the other island. Suddenly, Cliff meets Cale and Cleo there. Cale is offended by Cliff's deception in refusing to give them a ride earlier. But at the same moment, Nick shows up and saves Cliff from a dangerous situation, so to speak. Before leaving, Cleo says it's a mistake you didn't give us a ride. After resting, our couple started packing to go on their way. Suddenly Cliff notices that their tickets, or rather passes to the coast, are missing. So, while no one is looking, he decides to go through Cale and Cleo's things. He doesn't find the passes, but he does find a business card that says Ernesto Padillo, parole board. After a couple hours of walking, the two couples take a break to rest for a while. Nick decides to tell an interesting story from his life when he was in the army. It turns out that he was hit in the back of the head by a shrapnel from an anti-personnel mine, after which Nick was sent to Germany for treatment. In the hospital he had his head patched up with rocket titanium, and since then Nick can't pass through metal detectors, but now he always has his knife, Gigan, with him everywhere. When Sydney sees the knife, she gets scared. They continued on their way, and later Cliff calls Cindy ostensibly to the restroom to talk privately. There, the man manages to catch the net on his phone, and loads an internet page with a picture of the alleged killers. Cliff is horrified when he shows the picture to Sydney. But the girl calms Cliff, saying that it could be anyone, because the face is not even visible. Having calmed down a little, our couple continued their way to the coast. Soon a heavy downpour begins, and the foursome decides to pitch their tents and camp for the night. The girls stay behind to cook dinner. Nick, hearing some rustling in the forest, goes there together with a frightened Cliff. Wandering in the jungle, Nick touches on the burning topic and says that he understands Cliff, because he probably thinks that it is he and Gina, the sinister couple. But Nick doesn't hold any grudge against Cliff, because a screenwriter has to have a good imagination, and he has to handle all possible scenarios. During this time, Sydney and Gina share various secrets with each other. Suddenly, Sydney tells a creepy story from her youth, how she dated a guy named Rocky. Turns out one night the guy took her to the lake and they had a good time there. But suddenly Rocky turned on his headlights and made Sydney get out of the car so the girl could look at a mountain of leaves. There lay a neighbor's Labrador with a rope around his neck. Afterward, Rocky said he would kill Sydney if she told anyone about that night. Meanwhile, Nick heads deeper into the jungle, and Cliff notices an unknown couple. Cliff walks nearby and watches them. Suddenly, a guy named Chronic, who had earlier helped our couple load things into their car before starting their journey, approaches Cliff from behind. Chronic had just brought the passes that Cliff had forgotten at the store. A little later, Nick arrives with the loot, and Gina immediately takes to butchering the mountain goat. Sydney and Cliff watch the whole thing in horror. And when it's already dark, sitting in the tent, Cliff tells Sydney that these two are clearly some kind of dangerous. Our newlyweds plan to try to escape Nick and Gina in the morning, just so they don't suspect anything. Our foursome wakes up to the rumble of a police helicopter, which is inspecting the coast and orders everyone out of their tents. After looking at the faces of the guys, the helicopter flies on. But suddenly the police detain someone. Our four immediately runs to see who was caught there. They see Cleo and Kale being detained. The police find a box of teeth in their backpack. After that, Cleo and Kale are arrested and taken away by helicopter for suspicion of murdering the newlyweds from the neighboring island. Heading back to the campground, Gina admits that she thought Cliff and Cindy were the killers at first, and Sydney tells them that they thought the same thing about them. After a couple hours, our couples finally make it to the coast, which is famous for its beautiful sunsets. Cliff invites Nick to kayak down to a sea cave. Nick declines at first, as he had planned to spend the day with Jeannie. Then Cliff assures him that on the way they will discuss filming a movie together, and Nick immediately agrees. A couple minutes later, Gina comes to the beach. The girl sees Cliff and Cindy's camera and decides to look at their pictures from the wedding. Suddenly, Gina sees a completely different newlywed couple in the photos. The girl immediately runs to the sea and yells to Nick to go back to the shore. But the man only replies that he will be back by sunset. Then Gina quickly picks up her axe and runs to the sea cave. Swimming into the cave, Nick utters a phrase from a very famous movie, but Cliff didn't know about this movie, which is very strange for a screenwriter. And that's when Nick realized everything. It turns out that Cindy and Cliff are a couple of crazy people. They took the place of the previously murdered newlyweds, taking all their belongings and even their identities. Cliff's real name is Rocky, and he's the same guy who strangled the dog that Cindy told Ginny about. When no one saw, Rocky put his pliers and a box of ripped teeth in Cleo and Kale's bag and reported his suspicions to the local security guard, thus setting them up. Now, Rocky intends to steal Nick and Gina's identities. Rocky pulls out a gun and kills Nick with one shot to the head. Gina sees this and screams in terror. Rocky immediately aims at her, hoping to hit her, but the girl manages to move away from the cliff. At the same moment, Sydney runs up to Gina with a knife. A fight breaks out between the girls, but Ginny manages to throw Sydney into the water. At that moment, Jeannie's phone rings and the girl desperately explains the whole situation. Suddenly, the girl notices Sydney in the boat, and then Rocky climbs up the mountain to her. The man tries to pull her down the cliff by her leg, but Jeannie manages to grab a knife and stab him in the arm, and then she runs away. Rocky tells Sydney over the radio to swim faster to shore and go to the police before Jeannie does. At this time, the wounded Nick suddenly regains consciousness. It turns out that the gunshot hit the metal plate in the man's head. Gina comes down from the cliff and runs into a group of guys. The girl screams hysterically that she is being chased by a killer, but no one believes her. Rocky comes down next, and the man assures everyone that it's his girlfriend, and she's acting so strangely because of the drugs she took earlier. Rocky asks them to give him Jeannie. But suddenly one of the guys notices that the girl's pupils are fine, but Rocky's are dilated. Rocky immediately pulls out a gun and shoots the guys. However, Gina manages to escape while the man reloads the gun. At the same moment, Nick pounces on Rocky. After a brief scuffle, Nick grabs the gun and points it at Rocky. But at the same second, a police helicopter arrives, from which the police officers order him to put down his guns immediately, or else a shoot-to-kill will be opened. Rocky provokes Nick to shoot, talking about how many people have been victimized by him, and if Nick doesn't shoot now, Rocky promises that he will come back for them. The cop prepares to shoot, but at the same minute Gina runs up, and covering Nick with her body, she pulls him aside. Rocky tells them that Nick was wrong not to shoot him. Suddenly, Gina delivers a powerful leg kick to Rocky. Rocky then raises his gun and points it at the girl. At this time, Sydney tells the police that it was Rocky who killed all those people and ruined her whole life. Then a police sniper shoots Rocky. Next we see the victims being flown by helicopter to the hospital. Nick proposes to Jeannie, and the girl agrees, but on the condition that there will be no honeymoon. This is the end of the movie. Thank you all for watching this movie to the end. Give this video a like. Write in the comments what you think about this movie, and see you in new videos.